Hello and welcome to this, the third of 5 video lectures about the human value of tolerance. It is called Ethnicity Race and explores the question, when enforced ethnic racial segregation ends, then what? Up to now in this video lecture series, when we've looked at history, we've been mainly focused on the history of humanity as a whole. The history of our social development and the progress we've made away from the extreme poverty into which humans became conscious. But for this slide, we'll focus on the tribal history of the US. The US is not unique in having a tribal history. Everywhere in the West and everywhere else in the world, for that matter, has their own historical tribal story of suffering to tell. The US has a history common to all agricultural civilizations: conquest, colonialization, and slavery, and patriarchy with intolerance of any deviation from nuclear family values. Here we're just going to focus on ethnicity and race. There was the great dying of First Nation people. Around 90% of maybe 50 million indigenous North Americans died, mostly from European diseases, after European settlers arrived. There was also war and massacres, and the survivors, the First Nation survivors, were herded onto reservations. The people who got to the Americas first were the first to suffer. It was old world diseases brought to the New World with the colonists. That did most of the killing. First Nation casualties from war and massacre were in the tens of thousands. That was man's inhumanity to man. But tens of millions died at the hands of Mother Nature. African Americans arrived via the Atlantic slave trade. 10.7 survived of 12.5 million transported. Abolition was implemented in the US by civil war, only to be followed by 100 years of systemic ethnic racial segregation. Abolition, while welcome to anyone who holds the human value of tolerance dear, did not end the racism of white people. Segregation in the US and European colonization elsewhere in the world, European colonialism elsewhere in the world, was conscious, organized, rationalized racial separation. Racism holds that humanity is not whole, that individual conscious beings with free will and minds of their own are not equal, that some are more worthy than others. French, British, Russian, and Spanish lands acquired through purchase or treaty, that's acquired by the US. But Hispanic lands, Mexican lands, were acquired mostly through annexation and war. And the people that came with those lands were mostly mistrusted, often called bandits. To put it bluntly, if a little weakly, Hispanic people were unfairly treated by the US. Chinese were brought in as indentured labor, then castigated as the Yellow Peril. Japanese Americans were interned during the Second World War. Asians were not excluded from mistreatment either. And the early rulers in the US were not only white, but WASP. WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They looked down on and discriminated against Catholics, that's Irish and Italian immigrants, and of course Jews. The legacies of US tribal history included, mourning for the loss of ancestral homelands, the horror of industrialized slavery, the unfairness of events, collective memories of mistreatment, stories of immigrant ancestors struggling to establish themselves. This last point is often overlooked. Many white colonists, settlers, immigrants, whatever you will call them, struggled to establish themselves. Their struggle was with nature, chance, the malevolence of others and their own mistakes, and there was much suffering. But this slide is not about European people's struggles and suffering, but about society-enforced ethnic racial segregation. And in the US, leaving aside discrimination against non-WASP whites and Asian ghettos, that means facing up to white racism. A last point before we get into that, there are arguments made about US exceptionalism, but in having a history of suffering, of tribal suffering, the US is unexceptional. So what is the cause of the white man's racist past? Is it 1. White people are inherently superior. It's something good, inherited along with their skin pigmentation gene that makes them uniquely valuable to the world. Or is it 2. White people are inherently racist. It's something evil, inherited along with their skin pigmentation gene that makes them feel that they are privileged somehow. But genetics cannot explain how skin pigmentation genes carry superiority or racism. To use medical terminology, there is no genetic pathway from skin color to a psychological or social trait. Segregation, slavery, genocide in the histories of all agricultural civilizations, plus the 20th century fascists and Marxists. That's hundreds of societies all over the world across 7,000 years of agricultural civilization. All of them practice slavery. These evils are features of human history, not any specific region. The first agricultural civilization was the Summer civilization in modern-day Iraq. It started 7,000 years ago. Since then, there have been hundreds of distinct agricultural civilizations, and all of them, as far as we know, had slavery, regardless of the color of skin that the slavers and enslaved had. White Vikings enslaved white ancient Britons. Mansa Musa, the black 14th century ruler of Mali, took 12,000 slaves, his fellow Africans, on a pilgrimage to Mecca. From the 17th century onwards, white Europeans had global power enough to move slavery from a local endeavor to the globalized Atlantic slave trade of black Africans. This had nothing to do with the genes of the people involved. As explained in the video lectures on the human value of progress, the global dominance of Europeans, who happen to be lighter skinned mainly, came about due to geographical luck and cultural good fortune. It had nothing to do with genes. And today, 40 million people around the world live in slavery. Slavery being the ultimate intolerance. According to the International Labour Organization and the Walk Free Foundation, a person today is considered enslaved if they are forced to work against their will, are owned or controlled by an exploiter or employer, have limited freedom of movement, or are dehumanized, treated as a commodity, or bought and sold as property. That's a definition made by the abolitionist group Anti-Slavery International. Women and girls comprise 71% of all modern slavery victims, children making up 25%, accounting for 10 million of all the slaves worldwide. 10 million are children. Of the 40 million modern-day slaves, 25 million are in forced labor, which means they are working against their will and under threat, intimidation, or coercion. An additional 15 million people are estimated to be living in forced marriages. It's only really in the West that slavery has been properly abolished. Our human values include tolerance. and slavery is the ultimate intolerance. Being in chains or servitude means no freedom of choice. Having the fruits of your labour stolen from you means no freedom of enterprise. And worst of all, there is no freedom of conscience, because being a slave means being treated as an animal that just needs food and shelter in order to do work. It means not being treated as a conscious human being. Jordan Peterson studied those who committed the fascist and Marxist atrocities in the 20th century in Europe and concluded, all good and evil, there's good and evil in us all. And it's not obvious which will come out given a specific individual in specific circumstances at a specific time. All humans are capable of atrocity. In 1974 Rwanda, in a 100-day period, Hutus killed around 750,000 people, mostly of a different tribe called Tutsis. Tutsis called Tutsis. Then the Tutsis got the upper hand. They were better armed. They had guns instead of machetes. And they drove 2 million Tutsis out of their homes. That must be 2 million Hutus out of their homes. 20 years later, in 1995 Bosnia, Bosnian Serb forces killed 8,000 military-aged men and boys in Srebrenica. The victims were not combatants or prisoners, just Muslim men and boys that had been rounded up in villages that the Serbs had overrun. Groups are not evil, it's individual people. And those individuals can act collectively as like-minded people. Anyone who has spent any time in Germany or with German people or read German philosophy or listened to German composers can tell you that the idea of the German people being evil is nonsensical. But in the 1940s, circumstances in Germany were such that sufficient evil-minded people could be found to commit the Holocaust. Even though statements 1 and 2 above can be repudiated easily with a little applied thought, they are so easy for us to latch onto. We dig deep down into our subconscious value systems and up pops a feeling into our consciousness, and for too many of us, that's that. But this obsession with race is illogical. It is without reason. There is no genetic pathway from skin pigmentation genes to privilege or superiority. And history shows that no genetic racial group has a monopoly on atrocity. But 1 and 2, those two choices there, they're such effective memes. They're simple. They're historically plausible, and they affirm our prejudices. So, the white man's racist past. Can we get nearer to the truth? Through a combination of geographical luck and cultural good fortune, 16th century Europeans, white men mostly, were the first to go global, and they got to breakthrough progress first. The Europeans used the empire-building methods that were standard operating practice for all agricultural civilizations at that and earlier times, including war, massacre, genocide, forced trade, tribute, tax, colonialization, forced religious conversion, and slavery. The Penguin History of the World is a book in which I learned that lesson. Industrialization enhanced the power of colonizing Europeans relative to the rest of the world. As the West, they achieved world domination, but also started on social reform. The first major achievement was the abolition of slavery, the first such abolition since its inception 7,000 years before. But of course, segregation continued. After fascism was defeated and imperialism mortally wounded in World War II, European decolonization and US civil rights eventually ended society-enforced ethnic racial segregation in the West. And by prevailing in the Cold War, the West forced Marxists to end their political slavery too. And the book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn called Gulag Archipelago is a good place to learn about Marxists and their political slavery. What started out as European colonization transformed into global economic desegregation, also known as globalization, with breakthrough progress in the rest of the world, most notably in China. And in the West, Enlightenment values led to the emancipation of women, votes for all, and the decriminalization of homosexuality. Anti-discrimination laws confirmed equality for all before the law. How did white society mutate from a brutal, might is right agricultural civilization to become the pioneer of social desegregation? How did that happen? The answer is Enlightenment values. And since those values have been adopted successfully outside the West, where it just so happened that those ideas first appeared, we can decouple from their origin. We can decouple them, the Enlightenment ideas, from their origin and call them our human values. That is, liberty, progress, tolerance, and science. So what about white privilege and white superiority today? There's a famous paper called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It's by Peggy McIntosh. There is also a website reference below, number 1 below, where you can see the list that we're about to refer to. Peggy McIntosh in the 1980s made a list she described as the 50 privileges for whites in the US. Here are 3 examples from that list. Number 1 was, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. Number 32 is, my culture gives me little fear about ignoring the perspectives and power of people of other races. And number 50, I will feel welcomed and normal in the usual walks of public life, institutional and social. But in fact, this is a list of privileges for any majority group. It would apply to the Han Chinese in China, who make up over 90% of the population of China. It would apply to Muslims in northern Nigeria, who are the majority population. It would apply to alcoholics at an AA meeting, an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. It applies to Miami Dolphin football fans in Miami, because that's the dominant football team in Miami. Any majority group has automatic majority privilege. There's no prejudice or any kind of ism is involved. Right-handed people have majority privilege nearly everywhere and nearly always. There are other natural majorities. Heterosexuals are a majority in society as a whole. The able-bodied are a majority in society as a whole. So are the healthy. Adults, there are more adults than children. Citizens in any country, the citizen of that country, it's very rare if the citizens of that country don't outnumber immigrants and visitors. McIntosh's list is one of the most cited works in what detractors call grievance studies, but it's just a list that she made up. There's no academic literature search involved. It is not the result of any studies anyone has carried out. There is no analysis. In fact, there is no science of any kind whatsoever behind it. It's just a list of her feelings. But that's not all. It is also a mislabeled list. referring to supposed white privileged, rather than what it actually refers to, the privileges of any majority group. Selective privilege. Of course, privilege can be selective. Two examples cited here. Compared to citizens of the third world, Peggy McIntosh is privileged to live in a first world country, the US. Further, she has college degrees, which in the US gives privileged access to the job market. But none of that has anything to do with her skin colour. Summing up on majority privilege, any majority group, such as whites, they are currently a majority in the US, have majority privilege, unless there is some form of society-enforced social segregation, such as Alawite minority repression of the majority Sunni population in Syria, or Marxist minority repression of the majority non-Marxist population of Venezuela. McIntosh listed her personal feelings about being a member of the white majority tribe in the US. The list of 50 privileges for whites is considered a seminal work by many of those involved in grievance studies, in spite of it having no academic grounding whatsoever. That is far more a statement of the state of US academia than it is about the wider US. Similarly bereft of any academic grounding whatsoever are assertions of white superiority. Just as with McIntosh's list, non-whites are grouped together as a separate tribe, and attempts are made to rationalize claims with pseudoscience like eugenics or flawed historical narratives. But usually it's obvious that white supremacists are simply exposing their resentment at the removal of society-enforced ethnic racial segregation, which in the past favoured whites. The Economist magazine article cited below explains things well. Beyond a core belief in white superiority, white nationalists vary widely in their views. So when you hear of white consciousness, white separatism, or white nationalism, it's usually just a variation on the theme of white superiority. That core belief in white superiority is captured in a phrase canonized by white nationalists as the 14 words. They come from David Lane. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Talk of race suicide or the White Genocide Manifesto or the Great Replacement are derived from that core belief. Rather than spend a lot of time refuting that belief, let's cut to the chase with an observation. How is it that the proponents of the master race idea are some of the least attractive and seemingly dim-witted members of any race? But it is becoming increasingly obvious that ignoring white nationalists or just deriding them is dangerous. At the very least, the surge in terrorist activities by white nationalists need to be taken seriously by the security services. To come back to reason, to ground things in science, there is no genetic pathway from skin pigmentation genes to privilege or superiority. What about NeoSegregation? NeoSegregation is a term coined by the National Association of Scholars for practices they have reported on, including the article cited below by Dion Pierre. These practices are occurring on US college campuses today, on colleges both private and some public. On US college campuses, there exists segregated orientation programs, segregated dorms, segregated graduation ceremonies and events, segregated alumni groups. The author goes on to say that the first neo-segregated residence his research identified was the Malcolm X House at Wesleyan University. It was founded in 1969. This goes back 50 years to just after US colleges were desegregated. It goes back to the immediate aftermath of civil rights desegregation and the start of a dispute between integrationist and separatist black leaders. He talks about how these neo-segregation is seen as the voluntary and institutionally sanctioned segregation of minority students in the post-Brown v. Board area. Separate but equal again, he says. Separate but equal was a legal doctrine in United States constitutional law according to which racial segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. That amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law to all people. In other words, separate but equal was a legal defense of the Jim Crow South and its society-enforced ethnic racial segregation. The key words here are voluntary and segregation. The author of this article, cited below, detects an underlying political as well as gene-determined social movement. To quote from his article, Yale's Afro-American Cultural Center has distinctly political purposes, aiming at solidarity among disparate minority groups, and whites are kept out. Pierre states that this is part and parcel of the diversity agenda with its attendant college bureaucracy that he labels diversicrats. Again to quote, campus diversicrats are people who derive their livelihoods from neo-segregation and who wield a political base and a well-developed ideology. So, are the nationalist whites and neo-segregated people of colour tribes equivalent? No, emphatically no. Many whites can and do become honorary members of the people of colour tribe. White nationalists repel blacks. Many whites do choose to support the people of colour tribe, mostly out of a sympathy for historical wrongs. Though they can never be full members because membership is gene determined, the whites tribe does not invite non-whites to join. So there is no reciprocity. The white tribe is wholly gene determined. But there is a much bigger difference. White supremacy has terrible connotations for people of colour. The people of colour tribe has no history of oppression of the white tribe. Racism has, up to now, been a one-way street, whites oppressing people of colour. The white tribal leaders, by invoking white superiority, threaten to drag Western societies back to a history which we could not tolerate. This justifies treating the white tribe leaders with contempt and treating many of their followers as a security risk. That the formation of neo-segregated people of colour tribes is primarily voluntary is not in dispute. We can imagine that there are social pressures on people of colour to show solidarity with their gene-determined tribes, but this is not society-enforced genetic racial segregation. So the question arises, how does voluntary neo-segregation fit in a tolerant society? The short answer is that it has to fit because it exists, welcome or unwelcome. Nobody is suggesting that voluntary group celebrations or other voluntary group activities should be restricted. And so far, all these activities are supplemental to and not a replacement of the main orientation, graduation and alumni programs which are inclusive. And all of us are free to choose who we want to live with or share accommodation with. So what about a Euro-American cultural centre at Yale to go with the Afro-American cultural centre? That's not a good idea. It hints at white supremacy. The right crosses the line when there is talk about a separate white destiny or separate white whatever. That is just code for white supremacy, which has such terrible connotations for people of colour that even a hint of it is problematic. A conservative commentator, Ross Douthat, talks about how the right needs to quarantine racism because of what it has meant in the past. Voluntary chosen civic identities for minorities based on gene-determined ethnic race identity. We need empathy. In reality, whites need more than just tolerance, they need empathy. Deep in the collective subconscious of people of colour is the collective group memory of racism. For African Americans, segregation and slavery too. Whites just don't have these same collective memories. So whites need to understand that fear of racism, real or imagined, is something only people of colour experience. Such empathy means not using inflammatory language, such as white consciousness, separation or nationalism, or even cultural centre, even if the word white is replaced with Euro. Those words may sound benign to whites, but the collective subconscious of people of colour translate those words into white belief in superiority, which means racism and suffering, or it always did in the past. The fact is, we are probably only at the beginning of the healing of the scourge of global tribalism. As we started to globalize, that is, bring humanity together, starting 500 years ago, tribalism went global with the phenomenon we call racism. Our definition of tolerance in our human values does not need to change. Tolerance, that means freedom of conscience, freedom of enterprise, freedom of choice, is about step by step disinheriting ourselves from the limitations of the tribalism of our ancestors. But minority individuals should ask themselves, will neo-segregation support their education and development or not? Many minority individuals already say no and want no part in gene-determined ethnic racial segregation, however it's dressed up. And in considering their answer, minority individuals should also ask whether it's ever possible to be separate but equal. And what exactly do minority individuals miss out on by not choosing inclusive civic identities? So the final slide on tolerance and ethnicity race is a defense of human values and pluralism. 3 people walk into a bar, 2 black, 1 white. 2 of them are celebrity musicians. A tribalist sat at the bar turns to their companion and says, "Look, 2 black people and 1 white person just walked in." Their companion, a pluralist, scans the bar, spots a piano and says, "Maybe we can get them to play a duet." It just doesn't feel right, does it? 2 black-skinned people share genes for skin colour. A white-skinned person and a black-skinned person share genes that make them brilliant pianists. So why have we decided that one is the core of our identity and the other is a lesser trait? This quote is from Kwame Appiah, whose book Mistaken Identities is cited on the slide. He captures that feeling of unease just right. He, of course, was not the first. Martin Luther King dreamed that his children would not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. Strange things are happening today. For one, It's conservative thinkers now who are advocating for Martin Luther King's dream. Thinkers like David Brooks. The struggle between pluralism and anti-pluralism is one of the great death struggles of our time, and it is being fought on every front. We pluralists do not believe that human beings can be reduced to a single racial label. Each person is a symphony of identities. Our lives are rich because each of us contains multitudes. Brooks talks of pluralism rather than tolerance, but we know what he means. And he goes further. Pluralists believe in integration, not separation. We treasure precisely the integration that sends the anti-pluralists into panic fits. A half-century ago, few marriages crossed a colour line. Now 17% of American marriages are interracial. It seems many Americans are rejecting tribalism at the altar. We can't help ourselves asking questions like, where do mixed race people fit? Where do Asians fit in this white versus people of colour tribal society? And it's not just our feelings that make us uncomfortable with tribalism. They're statistics. If you take any trait, height, say, or wealth, you will find many tall and short black people and tall and short white people, with both groups having height in between. And you'll find both wealthy and poor people in both the white and people of colour tribes. Think about it. Tribalism is illogical because variation within populations exceeds the variation between populations. The conclusion of any reasoning person after a discussion on tribalism is always going to be the same. It doesn't feel right and it doesn't make sense because individuals are diverse, not groups. Thank you for watching. The next in the series, Understanding Ourselves Through Our Human Values, is the 4th of 5 lectures about the human value of tolerance. It is called Inequality and explores the question, what is society finding harder and harder to tolerate today? It can be found at www.conservatus.com, where there's reasoning that resonates. Conservatus. Keep safe, intact, safe from danger, our human values.